Hi, thank you, Dustin. My name is Abby Mayer, and I am currently at DSC Logistics working as a senior supply chain analyst in the solutions group. I'll start first by telling you a little bit about myself and my background, and really sort of how I got into supply chain. So during the summer of 2010, I was working at an internship for a company in the Powder River Basin in Gillette, Wyoming, a coal mining company. I went out to lunch one day with a coworker, and he informed me that it was a big day at work. We had just signed a large contract with a group of Indian power plants, and we would now be supplying coal to India. And this was one of the coolest things I'd ever heard. So I tried to ask him more to understand the process. And, he didn't know much about it, but he explained that, we were mining the coal in Wyoming. We put it on the rail. It went up to the port of Vancouver, and then it would go across to India. And to me, it was so interesting to think about the fact that that was the most cost-effective way to obtain electricity in India was coming out of, rural Wyoming. So out of that experience, I didn't know what that was called at that point, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do. So I did some research. I ended up I was accepted for a master's program in the UK. So I did a 12-month master's in supply chain management over in England. And then I worked for about 2.5 years as a research associate with a company called Supply Chain Insights, and I've been with DSC now in the solutions group for about 1.5 years. So that's a little bit about sort of who I am, where I've been, and how I really got into supply chain. I think today we really wanted to focus on understanding metrics. And this is something that I've worked a lot with in both of my jobs, both at Supply Chain Insights and at DSC. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I've used them in those two different roles and organizations. So at Supply Chain Insights, we were developing something called the Supply Chain Index. And this was our attempt. We wanted to understand how we could measure supply chains using financial metrics. So looking at financial metrics you might find in an annual report, you might find, so from a purely financial perspective, looking at return on investment, return on invested capital, days of inventory, days of payables, the current ratio. So really finance-focused metrics, and we wanted to understand if we could compare companies' supply chains based on those financial metrics. And so there was a lot of learning involved in this process. This is something that really had never been done before, but we were looking at these metrics, and then we were trying to see if there was a correlation to market capitalization, and then trying to understand how we could compare. So a lot of time was spent trying to delineate, first of all, the right metrics, the meaningful metrics, and then second of all, the right comparison. So finding, Procter & Gamble might be a company, and Procter & Gamble, we needed to have the right peers, so we needed to look at Unilever or Colgate. So companies that had a similar background, a similar product mix, similar size, and try to make those right comparisons to be able to do an apples-to-apples comparison. So that was really how I was using financial metrics at Supply Chain Insights, primarily the development of the Supply Chain Index. At DSC, I'm using metrics a little bit differently. So within the solutions group, there are two main projects that we work on. One of those would be network modeling, and the other would be RFPs. And so DSC, we operate about 62 warehouses spread around the U.S., and we're constantly bidding on new business for companies that are trying to outsource either their warehousing or the transportation component of their business. And so as a part of working on those RFPs, we'll develop a solution, we'll develop the pricing, the operational profile, and then we need to do internal gut checks to make sure that we have, the right solution designed. And so we might use some productivity benchmarks to understand, all right, if this profile is coming in 100% pallet and then being put away, what's the right productivity to assume that's going to help us get to the head count, it's going to help us get to the price for that operation. And so that's really how we're using metrics within DSC. I think another smaller piece, a smaller project that I'm involved in is sustainability at DSC. And so we'll also use metrics there. We track 5 metrics for each warehouse: electricity, natural gas, propane, water, and waste tonnage. And so trying to drive continuous improvement every year, that we're replacing light bulbs, that we're using less electricity, or we're, making better decisions about landscaping, and so we are reducing our water consumption. So that's another piece of where I'm really using metrics in my current role. Yeah, in terms of, why do I think metrics are important? I think so often, it's really important to, first of all, measure what's going on in the supply chain. And then second of all, it's important to have a comparison point. So if you look at a company and maybe they're focused on, let's say, inventory management, and so they start a new project, they have days of inventory at 25 on hand. And through rationalization, through, changing ordering patterns, they're able to reduce that down to 12. That's a pretty drastic improvement. And so from the outside, that might look like a clear home run. Oh, we reduced our inventory by half. We freed up cash within our supply chain. But the thing is, that company may want to compare to, what are its competitors holding in terms of inventory? Because if all the other competitors are holding something closer to 20 and they're, having less split orders, they're better able to fulfill those orders when they come in because they have a little more inventory on hand. Actually, that reduction to 12 is sort of a liability. And so I really think that, it's important to use metrics not only for internal measurement and to track improvement, but also for external benchmarking purposes and comparison. So it's not just about measuring within a vacuum. You first have to measure, and then you have to have a comparison. Yeah, in terms of where I've seen the best results, I think in both of my roles, so both at Supply Chain Insights and at DSC, you really have to get that comparison point right. And so what I mean by that is, for example, and maybe I'll use days of payables here. So a lot of companies have been focused recently on the cash-to-cash cycle. And so the 3 levers that you can really use to affect your cash-to-cash cycle would be days of inventory, days of payables, and days of receivables. And the larger days of inventory that increases your cash-to-cash. Same with days of receivables. And days of payables works in the opposite way. So if you can get the days of payables longer, you're actually reducing your cash-to-cash. You're holding on to cash longer because you're not paying your suppliers. And so that is important to understand, and it also can be dangerous. Because if you're withholding payment too long, if you're going from 60 to 75 to 90 days, you're really squeezing your suppliers, and especially if they're smaller organizations who don't have a lot of access to liquidity, you're making it difficult for them to do business. So if you're only focused on, what can I do to improve my cash-to-cash versus what can I do to improve my supply chain, because sometimes that might mean like holding a higher days of payables and understanding that improves the health of all your suppliers. So I think it's really understanding sort of the holistic look. And it's also understanding, like I've mentioned before, I think I'll just say it again, but having the right comparison point. So if you are a healthcare company or a medical device company that's doing a lot of case pick in the operation, a lot of each pick in the operation, sending out small LTL and parcel packages, we would never try to compare that operational profile to a food manufacturer that's supplying, distribution centers and that's 100% pallet in and 100% pallet out. So finding that right comparison point is equally as important as making the measurement, so tracking the metrics. Yeah, I think finally I would just say that, I think metrics are very important. Like I said, in both of my roles, I've used them a lot. It's a constant process of refining the measurements, making sure that everyone's on the same page. So I think, I was telling a coworker a couple of days ago, when we use the word inventory turns, we assume that everyone's saying the same thing, but actually sometimes people have different understandings. So really the first step is getting on the same page. So starting with a pretty basic conversation of, this is what I mean when I say this word, what do you mean? And then, starting that measuring, so starting to measure performance, and then finally the third level really is being able to use those metrics for comparison purposes against applicable peer groups. I think, I just wanted to thank you again for inviting me on to participate. And again, my name is Abby Mayer. I'm a senior analyst in the solutions group at DSC Logistics. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.